Hey everyone, we have Melton here. She's the Chief Strategy Officer at CoinShares, and she'll be doing a talk on securing financial networks, Bitcoin from a geopolitical lens. Once she starts talking, can you confirm in the chat that you can hear her?
Hi, everyone. This is Meltem here. Hopefully you can hear me. If not, I'm just going to keep talking. So really excited to be here for this great event, Future Proof. As I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about, one of the areas that I think is really interesting that we don't talk about enough in the crypto space is physical infrastructure. So today, you and I, I'm sitting here on my laptop. There's nothing plugged into it. I'm sitting here on my phone. My phone's not plugged into anything. And we don't really think about the physical infrastructure that our digital lives depend on. But one of the really cool things about Bitcoin and what we're doing in the crypto ecosystem is that we're creating not only software networks and distributed networks, but we're actually creating opportunities for us to disrupt the way that physical networks are structured and to change the actual topology of physical networks. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about an area I love, which is physical infrastructure. A little bit of background. I come originally from the oil and gas industry. So I spent my 20s, I'm not my 30s, I spent my 20s. So the first decade of my career, I spent in the oil and gas industry, in the energy industry, in the utilities industry. And what I focused on was capitalizing really large, ugly, long infrastructure projects that cost billions and billions of dollars. And now that I'm in the crypto space, I've been in this space for the last 6 years, we haven't really focused on the hardware and infrastructure yet. We've been really focused on software. But today I'm going to talk about where I think the hardware side of the crypto ecosystem will really start to matter, and going to tie it back to what's happening in the macro landscape and from a geopolitical perspective, what's happening with networks, with infrastructure, with network topology in our world today. So I'm going to try to keep it to 20 minutes. Sometimes I talk a lot, so I apologize in advance if I do that. So let me pull up my slides. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. I'm keeping an eye on it so we can make this conversational. I don't know if I'll actually be able to see once I start talking, though. I can't really see myself. Okay, hopefully you can see my slides. All right, so I'm going to talk about securing financial networks. Disclaimer, this is not financial advice. This is not a recommendation of any sort. Hopefully you know that. My lawyers want me to say that. All right, so the first thing I want to start with is when I entered the workforce in 2009, the world's largest companies, which you see on the left, were infrastructure companies. They built the physical infrastructure that our world depends on. I spent my career working in the energy industry, so I spent a lot of time with ExxonMobil and Shell and Petrobras. But in 2009, the 10 largest companies in the world had a combined market cap of around $2 trillion. Today, the world's largest companies are not infrastructure companies. They are digital intermediaries, and they have a combined market cap of over 8 trillion. Apple is actually 2 trillion of that. It's like absolutely mind-bending to think about how large these companies are. When I worked at Exxon, market cap was 400 billion, largest company in the world. Now, Apple, not 10 years later, $2 trillion. It's wild. But one important trend I want to talk about is the fact that the most powerful companies in our world today are intermediaries. And they control access to your digital life and your financial life. From the moment you wake up, you probably, if you're like me, first thing you do is check your phone. Maybe you pull out your laptop, you start working on your email, you talk to your friends, you open WhatsApp. You are interacting on an iPhone, interacting with Amazon when you consume content, interacting with Google and G Suite when you're talking to your coworkers. These companies are so ubiquitous that it's actually astonishing how powerful they are. And my perspective, so the first 10 years of my career were about energy, industrials, and banking. The decade of my career that I'm in now is about internet, tech, and payments. And I think the exciting opportunity for 2030 and beyond is in 3 areas: energy, compute and connectivity, and digital finance. And what's really interesting to me here is to think about how companies and nations alike will spend trillions of dollars on R&D, IP or intellectual property, and the physical infrastructure that they need to secure data and access to global systems. And I want to talk about this a little bit more. So cyberspace is the next frontier. We used to live in the physical world, but now we're migrating to the digital world. And in that shift from physical to digital, there's a huge amount of value that will be captured, but it's getting captured in very specific places. And it's being aggregated by these intermediaries who control our experience in this digital world. So welcome to your digital overlords, as I like to say. On the left-hand side, there's a graph from NBER, or the National Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is a US-based data sort of a think tank. It's a branch of the federal government. And here what you see is the amount of value that the digital economy adds to the US GDP and the share of GDP it commands. So the data only spans through 2018, but I imagine if we look at 2020, the digital economy would probably garner more than 10% of our GDP. So the digital economy is growing, but on the right-hand side, what you see is that growth is being disproportionately captured by a very small number of companies. When I first made this slide about 8 months ago, the market cap of the FANGs, or Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, was 17%. Today, it's 23%. So nearly a quarter of the S&P 500 can be attributed to 5 companies. That's absolutely crazy. If you don't think that's crazy, I don't know what to tell you. So we have these digital overlords. And more importantly, there is a $1 trillion federal opportunity. As warfare and political competition shifts from a physical realm into the digital realm, technology spending by governments continues to grow, and it's moving towards digital. So an important thing that I keep track of is US DoD spending, or Department of Defense spending. In the last year, the Department of Defense has put out 2 RFQs, or requests for quote, for 2 massive cloud procurement contracts on an unprecedented scale. The one you've probably heard about is the JEDI contract, which is worth $10 billion and was awarded to Microsoft. And there's also the DOS contract, which is worth $8 billion that hasn't been awarded yet. But what's interesting to think about here is the federal government here in this country alone plans to spend over $100 billion on cloud compute and services over the next several years. And what I wanted to show on the left-hand side is the key contenders for building this infrastructure. It's Microsoft, Amazon, IBM, Google, Oracle. So lots of money is at stake. And really what's at stake here is as we shift away from physical warfare to digital warfare, these behemoths, these digital overlords become so much more important. Here's what's really interesting as well. It's not just limited to software providers. So we look at this slide, most of the companies in that bottom left quadrant are software or enterprise SaaS companies. But again, since digital space is the new political frontier, we're seeing massive incentives to create a larger economy here onshore in the United States for physical compute and connectivity infrastructure. For example, TSMC, or Taiwan Semiconductor, which is one of the largest chip manufacturers in the world, is onshoring its plants into the US, and it's planning to spend $12 billion to build a chip plant in Arizona. US lawmakers over the last few months alone have proposed to spend over $20 billion on tax incentives for the semiconductor industry to onshore R&D and production. And investors are spending more money than ever on data centers as part of this critical infrastructure that's going to fuel the digital economy. So with that background, I want to, talk a little bit about what's happening politically speaking. I don't know how many people have been following what's happening in Washington, D.C. right now, but there's 2 important trends I want to talk about. One is the Clean Act and the Clean Network, and the second is the Earn It Act. So I'll start with Earn It. Earn It is a proposal that's on the table right now. It's a bill that's being proposed by Senator Graham, and what it would attempt to do is to remove end-to-end encryption from US software and US applications. So if you'll recall, in the 1990s, there was this series of legal battles called the crypto wars, and they culminated in the implementation of something called the Clipper chip, which was a chip that was implemented into devices that were end-to-end encrypted, and effectively were an attempt for the FBI and US intelligence to get a backdoor into these encrypted apps. Ultimately, all of that was overturned, and now we have end-to-end encryption. Code is part of speech. And so we have enjoyed sort of the last decade of, encrypted software, encrypted messaging technology, but that is all under attack right now. And one of the most important areas under attack is through this Earn It bill, which would attempt to remove the ability for US companies and companies operating in the United States to utilize end-to-end encryption and offer it to consumers. So write your senators. The Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF, is doing a lot of work on this topic as well. But please contact your local representative and tell them you are against Earn It. It is a terrible, terrible bill. The other thing that's been rolled out by the Trump administration with very vague details is this idea of something called the Clean Network. And it's a 5-pronged approach that includes carriers, cable, path and routing topology, apps, app stores, and cloud infrastructure. And what I think is really interesting is if you read the actual language of this clean proposal, really what they want to do is keep out untrusted Chinese telcos, i.e. Huawei. We also implemented RICO charges against Huawei, first time tech companies ever been hit with racketeering charges. Attempts to move Chinese apps from US app stores because we only want American apps to implement spyware and consumer-based surveillance capitalism. Clean apps that would allow, app stores to block foreign companies from offering services to US customers. Clean cloud, which should keep Chinese cloud providers from accessing data about Americans, and then clean cable, which really gets down to the physical networks that support internet infrastructure. And so you may look at this and say like, what? No. This is very, very important. If physical infrastructure becomes the next frontier, most people don't know that all financial transactions in the United States already run through the New York Fed. We're talking about creating a similar structure for our data, where all of the data and communications that go into and out of the US would flow through a central government surveilled hub. In my view, this is completely antithetical to what the internet is all about. It's completely antithetical to what I aspire to build and what the Blockstack community aspires to build. So I just wanted to share this background because I think we're at a critical juncture in our political, social, economic system. And if we allow governments to erode our freedoms for the sake of bringing security to technology, we're going to have no freedom at all. And so I think this is a really timely, really topical event to be having. I know there have been a lot of great talks today. There are a lot of great talks tomorrow. I'm really excited about them. But I want to talk to you about how we actually might be able to build a new physical infrastructure that supports a new internet and new infrastructure that we can build on. That's the point of this after all. So I'm optimistic. I want to try to find a solution here. I want to talk a little bit about where I came from, which is the energy industry. So the energy industry has been political for a long time. And perhaps the best example is during the 1970s, during the oil embargo, right? So in the 1970s, there was a big war in Iran and Iraq. And what ended up happening as a result is there's a massive oil shortage and the price of oil got really crazy. And there was this new geopolitical paradigm that was created where countries around the world realized that in order to fuel economic growth, they needed access to oil. And so it created a new paradigm where it was very, very important for oil companies to create a full vertically integrated cycle where they could access supply cheaply and build infrastructure to move oil around the world quickly. But not only that, in the 90s, we started to see financial market get built around oil. It started with people just looking to optimize selling and buying of their own supply. Then they started looking for ways to optimize the value chain. Then they started actively trading. Then they moved into pure trading. And eventually, most super majors built trading desks that were focused on pure financial speculation. And so this whole commodity trading ecosystem that got built really started from a very specific geopolitical need and evolved into an entirely new financial market that capitalized the build out of trillions and trillions of dollars of new energy infrastructure that we still rely on today. And this is what I spent the first decade of my career doing, is building $20 billion oil and gas projects in the middle of nowhere in the Arctic Circle in Papua New Guinea, in different places around the world. And what I think is so interesting here is we have the same analog that will happen in crypto markets. So I'll skip through this really quickly because I want us to talk about the crypto part. But I love this quote. I didn't even know it was a quote from the Bible, but apparently every quote is attributed to the Bible. It's what has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. And so I really view the growth of the Bitcoin ecosystem in a similar way. When I started in this industry in 2015, right, we're sort of in this early stage. Hopefully you can see my mouse here focusing on 2015. We had the earliest companies in the space were focused on building networking infrastructures. That was chip fab, that was mining pools, and that was really maintaining, propagating, expanding the Bitcoin network itself. And then on top of that, we saw the build of on and off ramps, so the ability for people to move fiat into and out of the Bitcoin ecosystem, companies building payment and transfer capabilities to satisfy a different set of use cases. Then we saw entirely new markets and new types of infrastructure get built that were purely crypto-based and really peer-to-peer based. And now we're in the stage where we're seeing new developer tools get built. And we sort of cycled back to the beginning. We're also seeing new networking protocols being created. And so what's interesting to me about the Bitcoin value chain is, if we start at the beginning, the Bitcoin value chain is really quite simple. You create a transaction, broadcast the transaction, it gets validated, and then it gets verified and mined. And that's really the whole process. There are a number of different companies that participate in this value chain. And by the way, this value chain is fairly consistent across different protocols. Some protocols add different steps or have slightly different ways of structuring it. But at the end of the day, when we're talking about building a new global financial infrastructure, what we're talking about when we talk about public ledgers, distributed ledgers, is the ability to create, broadcast, validate, and verify transactions on a global scale. So today, what's interesting about the Bitcoin ecosystem is no matter how efficient you are, you will never produce more Bitcoin than the block size reward. And where that starts to get interesting is the way that people create opportunity or economics of scale in Bitcoin is through three primary levers: technology innovation. And you're seeing that today with all these new layer ones that are looking to innovate as core the underlying networking topology of how Bitcoin works. Business model innovation, which is where people attempt to control transaction costs and optimize profitability, and financial innovation. And on the financial innovation side, there's some really cool stuff happening with hash rate derivatives, transaction fee derivatives, and different ways to financialize all of the aspects of the Bitcoin network that have economics associated with them. And what's really interesting to me as well is we like to talk a lot about software, but everything that happens in Bitcoin isn't just about software. We need hardware. And what's so interesting to me is on the right side, verifying transactions, validating transactions, we require a lot of hardware. But on the left side, we require more software. So there's this really interesting financial engineering layer that's gotten built to make it economically feasible for firms to backwards integrate from being hardware heavy into becoming more software driven. And for software driven firms who are focused on applications to forward integrate into nodes and infrastructure, wallets, and mining. So a lot of information on this slide. I'm going to skip through it. I have a penchant for over-engineering slides, so I apologize. Really what is so interesting to me is, as I mentioned, on the transaction creation side and broadcasting side, business models are typically asset light, meaning they're software driven. And when it comes to validating and verifying transactions, these companies are asset heavy, meaning they require a lot of CapEx and infrastructure investment because they're tethered to the physical networks, right? Like I have a cable that powers my computer. I'm consuming Wi-Fi, but that's driven by a cable that's wired into my house. So I think a lot of people don't appreciate, now I'm going to replug in my charger. A lot of people don't appreciate the relationship between physical assets, asset-heavy business models, and the maintenance and management of the Bitcoin network as a communication protocol. And in my view, in the next 10 years, in the next decade that's ahead for Bitcoin and all of these other crypto protocols, firms, governments are going to compete to secure access to the Bitcoin network. The Bitcoin network is the world's largest private telecommunications protocol, and what we're communicating is value. Bitcoin is the first open source, truly distributed financial ecosystem, financial network, financial protocol. Many others are being built like it, but Bitcoin is unique in the sense that there are over $250 billion worth of economic value on this one network. And so these asset-heavy business models become really, really important. So Bitcoin has one really important security measure, and it's the one we think about a lot at my firm CoinShares, and that's the hash rate, right? And if we look at the relationship between hash rate and price, what we find is hash rate and price have both risen as use of the Bitcoin network has grown. So Bitcoin's really interesting because it's a store of value as an asset, is a payment rail, and that the underlying Bitcoin protocol and Bitcoin network support financial transactions. And it's also a speculative asset in that you can bet on this future compute and connectivity and this future of open finance that hasn't existed before through owning Bitcoin. So for anyone who's a finance nerd, you've probably heard about WACC, or the weighted average cost of capital. One of the things I'm really excited about here. So for the last 6 years that I've been in this industry, the way that people have financed their companies, and I've known the Blockstack team for a long time, the way that you finance the growth of your project or your protocol or your company is through equity. And the cost of equity is very expensive. It's typically 20 to 40%. The cost of debt, however, is very different. And in the last 12 to 18 months, for the first time, we've seen the development of an asset-backed debt market for crypto infrastructure. So I want to pause there for a minute. An asset-backed debt market for crypto infrastructure. So what that means is I now have this new financing mechanism that, by the way, has significant tax advantages to help build out this physical network and this physical topology that's going to support my ability to interact with these new networks for money, these new networks for communication, these new networks for secure computation. That is so fucking exciting. We can delve into more, but I think this is one of the things people don't appreciate enough. This ability to finance infrastructure growth in a new way is going to usher in an entirely new era. And I would not be surprised if within the next decade, over 50% of Bitcoin mining happens within the United States of America, and Bitcoin mining becomes highly politicized as a result of the ongoing politicization of digital infrastructure. So Bitcoin's just getting started. If we look at futures and options volume across the board, like Bitcoin's not even a blip on the chart, although this year we're on pace to quadruple what we traded in 2019. But what's really interesting to me is Bitcoin as a communication technology and layer one protocols as communication technologies go beyond providing bandwidth and routing efficiency. What's really interesting here is we can start to add a level of discretion to control what's communicated, how it's communicated, and who it's communicated to. So while we may start with this idea of Bitcoin being a tool to create open, permissionless, peer-to-peer financial systems, really what Bitcoin is at its core is a telecommunication protocol. It allows for compute and connectivity, and ultimately Bitcoin is a money battery. Bitcoin is a way to translate energy into like physical energy, electrons, into monetary energy. And so what will start to happen is Bitcoin starts to move from being purely financialized to becoming integrated into compute and connectivity infrastructure, to becoming integrated into energy infrastructure, is the cybersecurity component of Bitcoin will start to become really important. And ultimately, the military industrial complex will need to participate in protecting and securing these new types of networks that haven't existed in the past. So my vision, what will the future look like? Well, here's a data center. One of the things that I'm really excited about with Blockstack and this community is the ability to bring together a group of like-minded individuals who believe in the importance of having, independent, peer-to-peer, distributed sort of communications and connectivity applications. And ultimately, the world I would like to see, like my version of the future, is for a number of us to get together and start to build out private telecommunications infrastructure to facilitate the ability for people to utilize mesh networking at scale, to facilitate the ability for people to have privacy in their communication, to have privacy in their financial transactions. So in my view, the future is very bright, and Bitcoin as a financial asset and Stacks as a financial asset and all of these other tokens as a financial asset are one way to help us bootstrap this different version of the future where infrastructure isn't owned by governments, but our infrastructure can be owned by us as a community. So I've talked a lot. I will stop there. Okay, hold on. Am I still on here? Hold on. How do I unshare my screen? Okay. Hugely dorky. Super excited about it though. Hopefully my enthusiasm comes across. So let's take a few questions. If you guys have questions or stuff you'd like to talk about, feel free to pop it in the chat. So yeah, so a few people have talked about the Earn It bill. Please read about it. It's extremely, extremely concerning. Like, in my view, the crypto wars, we fought 3 crypto wars now. When I talk about crypto wars, I don't mean cryptocurrencies, cryptography wars. The first crypto wars were fought in the early 1990s. Obviously, that culminated in the implementation of the Clipper chip and the subsequent downfall of the Clipper chip. But right now, what's really interesting about the Earn It bill is one of the provisions in the Earn It bill is to fund like $100 million hackathon to challenge people to break end-to-end encryption, like to break SHA-256, which in my view is a fucking bonkers that a government would sponsor private industry to try to break the encryption that sort of powers the backbone of our internet. The whole reason we have online commerce is because of encryption. And so in my view, like, we have a government that fundamentally does not understand how technology works, and we're flirting with fucking disaster. So if you have any time at all, like, please read about the Earn It bill, please educate yourself, please vote in line with representatives who share your principles around the right for citizens to have access to compute and connectivity. And please, like, vote for people who understand how technology works, because our current people do not understand it. It's very sad. All right, some more about sound. Sorry, hope you guys could hear. You can watch the replay. Geopolitical threats to Bitcoin. Okay, so where I think geopolitical threats to cryptocurrency become really interesting is this. One of the things we always talk about in the crypto community is, like, we can have peer-to-peer infrastructure, we can have peer-to-peer compute connectivity, and we can build these networks that are outside of governments and financial system. But at the end of the day, if we are building Bitcoin on top of the existing telecommunication networks, we have zero fucking privacy. Because at the end of the day, if I rely on cable, right, and wire and fiber that's running through my house, through my neighborhood, through my country to connect to the Bitcoin network doesn't fucking work, right? We always talk about censorship happening at the application level, in the sense that governments will first attempt to attack Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies by going through the banking system, similar through Operation Chokehold, where governments cut off, the US government in particular, cut off the ability for gray industries, i.e. porn, guns, cannabis, etc., to access the banking system. We could see an attack in that way, where we see the banks being targeted and the banks being attacked and not being able to interact with Bitcoin companies. But the far, far greater threat is what we see in other economies, where the implementation of a firewall and the ability to control the actual telecommunication networks we rely on inhibits our ability to communicate with one another. And there are some solutions to this. Like, a lot of people talk about mesh networking as a potential solution. And I host a mesh networking meetup in New York. We've had GoTenna come, we've had Helium come, we've had a bunch of Althea Network, like a bunch of different projects focused on mesh networking come. The issue is, at the end of the day, if you're relying on a mesh network, you still have to access an IXP or an internet gateway. And the issue is that we really, really need to build private telco infrastructure that doesn't rely on the existing physical capacity, the existing physical cable, physical wire to connect us to the Bitcoin network. So I've gone over my time. I apologize. I will hand it back. If you want to talk to me, my email is widely available. I have open DMs on Twitter. Would love to chat with you. But my goal, Blockstack community, is in the next few years, I would love for us to work together and build our own private telecommunication network funded by us as a community and to operate it via satellite, via servers floating on boats, whatever it takes. But I would love to see us as a community focus less on just software and focus more on actually building out physical infrastructure to support a digital world that is free of monopolies and corporate overlords. Let's do it.
Melton, this was great. Thanks so much for your time. We're going to transition to the next talk now.